Hello everyone! This is a continuation of our series of all 1,800 kilometers of bike paths in Korea, for a total of 85 stamp booths to stamp in the Korean bike passport and receive the Grand Slam medal. And today we're looking at the 8th and final path in Korea, the Four Rivers Cross-Country Bike Path, extending from the northwest in Incheon, close to Incheon Airport, all the way to the opposite side of Korea in the southeast in the famous beach city of Busan, for a total of 633 kilometers officially. But if you decide to collect all the stamps in one go, then it's over 750 kilometers long. In this video, we'll give an overview of the path, show you how to get there, and give itineraries for different types of cyclists depending on how far you want to cycle every day. The itineraries are in the description of this video, which include Kakao map links for each day that can be converted to GPX files on Google Chrome if needed. And the Chrome extension that does this conversion is finicky, so sometimes you have to click around a bit and refresh to make it work. In our last video in the series, we completed the ranking of all 8 bike paths in Korea, and the Four Rivers Cross-Country Bike Path ended up at number 3. However, it's the most famous bike path in Korea for a couple of reasons. First of all, if people are linking up with cycling across Japan, they can easily link up the countries by taking the ferry from Busan to Fukuoka or vice versa. Also, there's just something special about the experience of traveling across the entire country of South Korea, between its two biggest cities in Seoul and Busan. Let's start out with an overview of the path. The Four Rivers Cross-Country Bike Path consists of 4 different bike paths: the Ara, Namhangang, Seje, and Nakdonggang bike paths, connected together for a total of 633 kilometers, which makes it the longest official bike path in Korea. And there's a lot of confusion with the naming that I didn't realize until now, so let's clear that up. The Four Rivers bike path technically refers to the 4 largest rivers in Korea, being the Hangang, Yongsangang, Kumgang, and Nakdonggang rivers, and there's a medal specifically for cycling all of them, which isn't one continuous path. The section in this video from Incheon to Busan is technically called the cross-country cycling road, but for some reason everyone has been calling it the Four Rivers bike path for quite some time. And let's talk about the difficulty, which I'd rank as the second most difficult bike path in Korea, with about 4,700 meters of elevation gain over 600 kilometers if you bike directly from Incheon to Busan, and 5,700 meters of elevation gain if you plan to stop at Chungju Dam and Andong Dam along the way, which adds about another 150 kilometers total of cycling to the journey. If you're just getting into long-distance cycling, it'd be best to try out one of the shorter bike paths first in part 1 or part 2 of this series. The Four Rivers Cross-Country Bike Path is also mostly separate from cars, with a few sections here and there where you're on the shared roads, but not as many as you'll encounter on the East Coast or Jeju Fantasy Bike Pass. There are also longer sections of about 40 kilometers or more without convenience stores, so it'd be good to stock up with 2 bottles of water and extra energy bars or snacks to eat or drink when needed. As far as weather goes, it'd be best to cycle between early April and mid to late June, or early September to mid-November. And if you're camping, June and September would be the most pleasant at nighttime without having to worry about the cold at all. But you can camp in April and early November too if you're well prepared, as it can get down to 0 degrees at nighttime no problem. Wind in Korea tends to come mostly from the northwest, so I'd recommend starting in Incheon and ending in Busan to have the greatest amount of tailwind. But this will vary a lot and won't be totally predictable. And if you want to camp for free, you'll have to stealth camp mostly. And as long as there aren't signs that tell you no camping, there's a good chance you won't have problems if you aren't on other people's property, and stay quiet and clean. But we won't make specific recommendations to avoid sending too many people to the same locations. So now let's look at the path itself. And when we filmed this footage, we are cycling in the opposite direction, starting in Busan and ending in Incheon, which is also totally fine to do. But since most people will be starting in Incheon, just pretend we're cycling the opposite direction in the clips. And I'll mix in our older footage here and there so it doesn't get too confusing. The path starts at the Ara West Sea Lock Gate, which has a lookout and also a ferry that goes along the Arabekgil, or sea waterway, that connects to the Han River in Seoul, which is also the first 23 kilometers of the bike path. And then you arrive at the massive Han River that goes through the center of Seoul, riding along one of the best bike paths I've ever ridden in any city, depending on how many other people there are, of course, as it can get pretty crowded during the weekend. Riding through Seoul, you go past Yeouido on the south side of the Han River, which is a man-made business district island. Then Pampo Hangang Park, which has a 2-story bridge connected to it to ride along to the north side, and then continue on to Duksum Resort. And if it's warm, you'll see many people outside enjoying chicken and beer or any other delivery food they want to eat. And it'll be hard to stay motivated to keep pedaling ahead, as the Han River is one of our favorite outdoor places to hang out in any country we've ever been to. There are a lot of people for sure, but it doesn't feel crowded or anything. And it's a lot of fun to people watch and also check out the beautiful Seoul skyline as it changes to nighttime. If you've come to Korea just to cycle, make sure you spend a few nights in Seoul, as you'll regret it if you miss out on the entertainment-packed city, filled with a lot of traditional culture in the northern Jongno area as well. After leaving Seoul, you head past Hanam, and from this point on, you're starting to leave civilization a bit, with smaller cities popping up every 30 or 40 kilometers. So it'd be good to be prepared with some extra water and snacks at this point on. You then ride past Paldang Dam, then a really cool wooden bridge that goes along the Gyeonggi-Jungang line, and then into the forest, with plenty of tunnels. And you start to feel like you're in the countryside a bit now, higher up on the river until you head into Yangpyeong, which is a good spot to stock up on supplies or spend the night if you need to. South of Yangpyeong, things stay pretty similar for the next 45 kilometers or so, staying pretty flat for the most part except for a couple hills that are less than 100 meters high, staying mostly next to the Han River. And you're more or less in civilization, as you're still in Gyeonggi-do, the province that surrounds Seoul and has a population of 26 million. And the most exciting thing about the river is looking at the various bridges, which is one of the highlights of the entire bike path, as the bridges are all built differently all the way down to about Daegu, about 2/3 of the way into the journey. And then you head into Gangwon-do, about 150 kilometers into the ride, the mountainous province of Korea, but you're only in it for a small little stretch. However, you do feel the environment changing a bit, with everything getting bigger, especially the mountains and some of the bridges. And from this point forward, you start to leave civilization for the majority of the ride until Busan. So every time you enter into a city from now on, you should be thinking about if it's a good spot to stop for a meal, or stock up on water and energy bars, or even if you want to spend the night, as you'll regret it if you just blast by a city, and then later realize you should have used the amenities while they are around. You're now about 40 kilometers until Chungju, and to be honest, the section between Gangwon-do and Chungju is mostly forgettable, but there are a few nice parks here and there. Once you arrive in Chungju, there's a stamp a bit less than 10 kilometers away at the Chungju Dam. So if you're collecting all the stamps, it's important to know that you'll have to take a little bit of a detour. And also, Chungju is the biggest city you'll pass until Daegu, with plenty of bike stores if you need anything at this point, as you'll be heading through the mountains in the next section, so it'd be good to make sure you're prepared. Just south of Chungju is a really beautiful section of the ride, with the suspension bridge that might be familiar if you've watched other videos on the Four Rivers bike path, and some really nice mountain valley river cycling. And the scenery will slowly change into the mountains as you head into Suwambo, which is an oncheon or hot springs town, and also a great place to stop for a bite to eat and walk around a bit, or even spend the night, as it's a beautiful little town. And then directly after Suwambo, it's time for what many call the biggest challenge of the journey. You start out with a 2-kilometer ascent with about 200 meters of elevation gain called Sojoryeong, which isn't too steep and a great warm-up for the biggest hill of the entire ride, the infamous Ihwaryong. But before you get there, there's an interesting village called Haengchongri, which is also the intersection between the Four Rivers bike path and the Ocham bike path. But it's time to start the challenge. The Ihwaryong climb is about 5 kilometers in length and 500 meters in elevation gain, and took us about 45 minutes to climb with our heavier tour bikes. To be honest, the climb isn't insanely steep, at about a 10% grade overall, so you can get into a nice rhythm without overexerting too much. But it's definitely a challenge, and it feels amazing when you get to the top.
We did it. Ihwaryong. 진짜 잘했어. Good job,
And you can really appreciate just how much you've come up with the amazing view into the valley when you get up there. There's also a little rest stop up top that sells a few different meals and has a little convenience store too. And now it's time to ride downhill. And you're heading into the real countryside section of the journey for the majority of the ride until you get to Busan. The next city is Mungyang, and the entire 35 kilometers from the peak at Ihwaryong until there is downhill. So it almost feels like you're riding an e-bike, which is a nice break from the mountain climb. Mungyang is a fairly decent-sized city with all the amenities you need to spend the night or to stock up. And this is the point where you need to make the decision if you're going to head into Andong or not, which is a 65-kilometer detour, which you don't need to get the cross-country medal for completing Incheon to Busan, and need only for the 4 rivers and Grand Slam medals. And it'll also add a day or 2 onto your trip if you go there. There's also not much after Mungyong no matter what you decide to do, so definitely be prepared from this point. South of Mungyong, you're getting really into the countryside. It's basically flat farms and fields for the next 20 kilometers, and then you reach the Nakdonggang River. And at this point at the Sangpung Bridge, you can start heading east right after collecting the stamp, and you're starting the journey to Andong. The 65-kilometer ride to Andong consists of real country roads that go through the farmland, wooden decks that follow along the trees past the rougher sections of land, and then some cool bridges that almost feel like you're in a Western movie. The first 36 kilometers of the detour are pretty barren, and then you arrive at Pungcheonmyeon, where there are some places to eat, and the Andong Hahoe Folk Village, which is a great place to learn about Korean history, and is said to be like a big museum, which we still want to check out. And just about 6 kilometers north, there is the Gyeongsangbukdocheong, with some places to stay and eat if needed. Then when continuing to Andong, you get a lot more of this, and then 2 decent-sized hills before entering the city limits. Andong has a population of 120,000 people, and you have to ride through the city, which is separated by the Nakdonggang River, until you get to the Andong Dam. Also, Andong is a great place to stay, with a ton of amenities, and the home to Andong Soju, which you can try a sample of, a traditional type of soju that has been made since the Shilla dynasty from over 1300 years ago, in 668 AD. Once you're ready to continue south, you bike back the 65 kilometers you just came from, and then continue down. Now you're pretty much out of civilization for the next 64 kilometers or so. You pass the tourist area called Gyeongcheondae Gwanggwangji, which is known as a vacation area to spend time in nature, and there are some campgrounds nearby too, and a few hills here and there, but nothing that really sticks out. And it's good to note that once you get to Nakdongyo, there are a few motels nearby if you need to stay, with some convenience stores and restaurants too. But don't camp next to the bridge like we did and get yelled at the next day, as it's not allowed. But we arrived when it was dark and didn't know. And then from there, you cycle on ahead without anything for about 36 kilometers until you reach the city of Gumi, which is a pretty large city at about 400,000 people, and has everything you could need to spend the night in if necessary. And from this point for the next 85 kilometers or so, you're back in civilization for a bit, riding through the forests, on some cool decks that are above the water, and then you make it to Daegu, the 4th largest city in Korea at about 2.4 million people. Daegu has some really nice cycling infrastructure, with some amazing bridges and beautiful paths around the river just like you get in Seoul. On the ride, you aren't actually going into the city, so if you're curious about it, definitely make the trip to Daegu to explore. And once you're ready to start heading south, you're just about to enter another fairly desolate area. But you have one more city about 35 kilometers down the flat path called Gujimyeon, which is technically still part of Daegu. And now you're 600 kilometers into your journey if you've been collecting all the stamps, and you're just about to head into the hardest section in my opinion. And definitely stock up, as the next 55 kilometers or so has just one convenience store as far as I'm aware. And this is the most difficult section of the whole ride in my opinion, with 3 really steep difficult hills. You start out with one of the steepest at the Temple Mushimsa, which goes up about 150 meters in elevation, but it's really rugged terrain, and not even fully paved, making it a real challenge. But this section can be skipped if you want. Then you're back on the barren flat terrain again, and you're now briefly in Hapcheongun, which is one of the most beautiful regions in Korea that not many people know about, until you reach the second hill, this 13% grade hill that's over a kilometer long that goes up to 170 meters in elevation, which almost feels impossible to cycle up with a heavy bike. And then the last hill that's a little bit mellower, but takes a lot longer, and ends up in the farmland until you reach the city of Namji. By this point, you've gotten all the hard parts of the ride out of your way, and you're slowly going to head back into civilization. But you aren't quite there yet, as you still have a good 93 kilometers or so until the end in Busan. And what do you know? More of the same countryside vibes just like you've been cycling for the majority of the ride, with sections of about 30 kilometers without much civilization. And it feels like it takes forever just because you've been seeing this kind of scenery for most of the journey. And there aren't really any specific landmarks here, just the long flat bike path until you reach these train bridges, which are really cool and can be used kind of like a landmark that you're about to make it into Busan. From this point forward, you'll see a lot of cyclists emerge, as people from Busan are making day trips up north for a leisurely ride, as you're about to finish off the 750-kilometer cross-country excursion you've just endured. You're constantly riding next to the water on these decks, which are really fun to cycle on, and if you have a cycle tour set up, you'll get a ton of hellos and waves from fellow cyclists who know what you've just been through. And alas, it's time to arrive in Busan. you can really feel the larger population, as there are always lots of people walking through the parks, and this last section seems to last forever as you're going through this forest path through the city. It goes on for almost 20 kilometers or so, and then you can slowly see Eulsukdo, the island in the middle of Nakdonggang. And by the time you reach the bridge, you're on the last little stretch, and you can certainly feel your emotions rise and a sense of excitement that you've just made it across the country of Korea by bike. I still remember my wife Yujin and I bursting into tears of joy when we arrived here our first time in 2019.
Oh! We did it, babe. 수고했어.
And we hope most of you watching this will get the chance to do the journey yourselves someday and create your own memories like this. It's not the best bike path in Korea at number 3 out of all 8 bike paths, but this is just our opinion, and many will probably consider it number 1, and it's definitely an amazing adventure that's 100% worth doing. The scenery is pretty similar for most of the ride, with the exception of being near Seoul, going through the mountains near Ilhwaryong, and the section with the 3 hills near the end, but it has the most prestige, as there's just something special about traveling across an entire country like this by bike. And I think that's why it's the most famous bike path in Korea, that most people seem to do that travel here. Also, the fact that it ends in either Seoul or Busan is special, as they are by far the most 2 popular places to travel in Korea. So there will be lots of things to do when starting or finishing your journey, no matter what direction you choose to cycle in. Now let's look at how to get there. Let's start out with the question that most people ask: how to get to the start of the path from Incheon Airport. Before you take your bike out of the bike box or bike bag you have, there are a few things to consider. First of all, if you just want to make it easy and take a taxi, you can take a venti taxi, which is basically a big van, and you could definitely fit 1 bike in a box or bag inside the van, and possibly 2 depending on the size. And it's about 40,000 won to the entrance of the path at Hahoe West Sea Lock. Or if you want to go to Seoul first, it should cost about 80,000 won, but this will get more expensive at nighttime. Just follow the signs to the taxis outside, and don't talk to the drivers that'll hassle you at international arrivals, and make sure the taxi driver uses the meter. You can also take the airport railroad line, which is linked to the Seoul subway for a lot cheaper, but these are some very important things to know. If you have a fold-up bike, you're allowed to ride the airport railroad any day, as long as you fold up your bike when getting on the train. If you have a regular bike that doesn't fold, you can leave it in the box or bike bag and also ride the airport railroad at any time. But this will be a huge hassle in my opinion. If you want to assemble your bike at the airport, you can only ride the airport railroad with an assembled bike on weekends or holidays. And you have to reserve the time slot on this website, which we linked in the description, which is only available on the Korean version. So use Google Chrome to translate the page into your language, and sign up with a Google or Facebook account to reserve a time. Once you are logged in, click Reservation Request on the bottom right, and then on the next page, it bugs out when selecting your date in English. So make sure to select it on the original Korean version first, and then translate the page to English and finish filling in the form. I know this is a hassle, and if you can't figure this step out, you could probably ask the people working at the airport railroad to get on without reserving, and they should help you. But this isn't a guarantee. And then you just ride the subway 4 stops from Incheon Airport Terminal 1 to Cheongna International City, and get on the subway on the first or last car of the train. If you're in Seoul, you can also take the airport railroad train from any of the stops to Cheongna International City Station if you follow the same guidelines. And once you get there, you can cycle about 3 kilometers to the entrance of the path. And in Busan, the end of the trail at Nakdonggang Estuary Bank is only 8.5 kilometers away from the Busan-Seobu Intercity bus terminal. And you can put your bike in the luggage compartment of the buses below. And in Busan, you can take your bike onto the subways on all days, even if it's assembled. And it's only 2 kilometers to the finish from Hadan Station on subway line number 1. Now let's look at an itinerary for experts who can ride up to 130 kilometers a day. And also for people who want to go at a slower pace and sightsee a bit more, up to about 80 kilometers a day. Also, the itineraries in the video will be for collecting all the stamps and stopping at Chungju Dam and Andong Dam. But if you check the itinerary in the description, we added 2 more for those who just want to cycle Incheon to Busan directly, which is enough to get the stamps for the cross-country medal. Let's start out with experts. This itinerary will be 7 days of cycling, averaging at over 100 kilometers a day, so be prepared for that if you want to take on the challenge. On day 1, you'll start at Hahoe West Sea Lock Gate, cycle the Arabekgil or Hahoe Waterway, and then through Seoul on the amazing Han River for a total of 108 kilometers and end up in Yangpyeong, a city in the suburbs of Seoul. On day 2, you'll cycle 111 kilometers out of Gyeonggi-do province and into Gangwon-do for a bit, and end up in Chungju City, the last big stop before tackling the biggest mountains of the journey the next day. On day 3, you'll cycle up to Suwon-bo with all the hot springs where you can grab lunch or a snack, and then tackle Sojoryeong and Ihwaryong, the 2 biggest climbs of the journey. Then it's all downhill from there to finish off the rest of the ride, 81 kilometers into Mungyang, the last big city until you finish the next day of cycling. On day 4, you'll head into the countryside farmland, mostly away from civilization, so prepare in Mungyang, and cycle east about 93 kilometers all the way to Andong, the city rich with Korean history and the Hahoe village, and stop in Andong for the night. Then on day 5, you'll be cycling a long day at about 127 kilometers, but as you can see, it's slowly going downhill. Also, it'd be good to prepare food and water in Andong before departing, because you'll be away from civilization mostly until you arrive into Gumi. On day 6, you'll be in civilization again for most of the day, as you cycle 108 kilometers past Korea's 4th largest city in Daegu, and continue all the way past the Temple of Mushimsa into Hapcheongung, the beautiful mountainous area, and you'll stay in Anjingni, a tiny little area with a few motels, restaurants, and a convenience store, and you'll spend the night there. And then on the final day, you'll be making the biggest push of the journey, at 128 kilometers, starting out with 2 pretty difficult climbs, and then the rest of the day will be flat through the countryside, as you slowly make your way into civilization, and then finish in Busan to celebrate. For those who want to sightsee a bit more, you'll notice that the days are longer than we've been using for the other bike paths in Korea, for a total of 11 days at an average of 60 to 70 kilometers per day. And that's because there are long sections in the middle of the countryside where it's not super easy to find places to stay, so I'd make sure you can cycle about 80 kilometers per day before tackling this itinerary. For day 1, you'll start at the Ara West Sea Lock Gate, cycle through Seoul and the Han River past Yeouido, Pampo, and Duksum for a total of 73 kilometers, and finish at Hanam, a new city right to the east of Seoul. Then on day 2, you'll be slowly cycling away from Seoul into Gyeonggi-do, past some army bases, and end up in Yeoju for a total of 65 kilometers, a nice little city on the river with some parks and space to walk around. On day 3, you'll be biking 78 kilometers out of Seoul's surrounding province of Gyeonggi-do into the mountainous Gangwon-do region for a bit, and then continue ahead to Chungju, the last city before the hardest day. Day 4 will be the hill climb day, going up through Suwon-bo with the hot springs, and then tackling Sojoryeong and the famous Ihwaryong, to end the day with a nice mellow downhill ride to complete 59 kilometers north of Mungyang. And then for day 5, you'll cycle your longest day at 84 kilometers down past the main city in Mungyang, where you should prepare before heading into the countryside, as the last 60 kilometers of the ride will be mostly next to farms and away from civilization, until you end up at Gyeongsang-bukdocheong. And here you should reserve a hotel for 2 nights, as on day 6, you'll be heading into Andong to get the stamp at Andong Dam, grab lunch in Andong, and then bike back for a total of 65 kilometers, where you'll spend the second night in the same hotel. And you can also visit the Hahoe village, which isn't too far away. Then on day 7, you'll spend the entire day out of major civilization, biking back to the main route going down to Busan, and then continuing south for a total of 67 kilometers, where you can get a motel in Nakdongmyeon or Tammilmyeon, which are right across the bridge from each other. For day 8, you'll have another longer day of 83 kilometers biking back into civilization, passing the city of Gumi around lunchtime, and then continuing on into the city of Daegu, where you'll spend a night or 2 as it's a massive city with tons of hotels and restaurants. On day 9, you'll be biking south of Daegu past Gujimyeon, and then back into the countryside where you'll pass the first of the 3 big hills of the south at Mushimsa, which can be skipped if you want, and continue on into Angjinni in Hapcheongun, which is the only spot that's decent to stay in this area without pushing ahead another 35 kilometers and 2 more big hills. Then during day 10, you'll tackle the last 2 of the 3 bigger hills in the south, and bike past Namji, a medium-sized city where you can grab lunch and stock up a bit, and then back into the really flat countryside until you make it into Hanam, a small little town where you'll finish off the 64-kilometer ride and prepare for your last day. And then on day 11, it'll be a breeze. It's 66 kilometers, but almost the entire day will be flat, and you'll slowly be approaching civilization until you reach the finish in Busan. Woo! Woo! That's what I'm talking about. We're done. And that does it for the Four Rivers cross-country bike path. We hope this video helped show you what you can expect from the ride, and provide a few tips to help you plan your trip. And of course, not everything can make it into the video, so feel free to ask any questions you have in the comment section below. And stay tuned for the end of this bike path series, where we'll go over general questions about biking in Korea. So this is your chance to ask away in the comments, and we'll answer as many as we can to end this series. As always, thanks so much for watching, and happy cycling!